Delightful piece of music, a very warm welcome to Music Club members and special guests to our presentation on Franz Liszt for this evening. We're delighted to welcome Robert Mansell, I think well known to most of our Music Club members. He has been a member of the committee for some years, is very actively involved in all activities of the club. Robert is a composer, a playwright. We've heard some of his music previously, a delightful evening based on the life of Marlene Dietrich some years ago. He's also written a play on the life of Cosima Wagner. His speciality is very much Wagner and Liszt, and so delighted, therefore, to welcome him for this evening, Robert Mansell.
Now, that music which we began with was by our hero, but I just wonder whether anybody recognized it. Probably not. It was Sonata del Petrarca No. 3, sung by Margaret Price, accompanied by Cyprian Katsaris. From now on, I'm mostly only going to play very small extracts because otherwise we'll be here all night. And also I'll be playing some rather less well-known pieces. And so to start with, I thought it might be amusing to begin with Liszt's rarely heard Opus 1, No. 1, written when he was just 13. It's a very short etude in C major, only lasting just over 1 minute. for a 13-year-old. And by the way, that picture you were looking at was not Livia Rev, the performer. It was indeed a picture of the young Franz Liszt. He was born in 1811 in the tiny hamlet of Riding, Deborge, in the Esterházy county of what is then best described as Austria-Hungary. We should be looking at a picture of the house now, I think. Yes, there it is, very uninspired. His birth is registered as Franziskus Liszt, L-I-S-T, no Z. Initially, he was taught music by his father, who, although only a manager of sheep for Count Esterházy, was a modest amateur musician. At the age of 7, young Franz was said to be already writing more notes than ABC letters. He performed in public for the first time, aged 9, some improvisations of his own, plus a concerto by Ferdinand Ries. Now, this is the only music I will play this evening which was not actually composed by Liszt. But here's the beginning of Ries's piano concerto, third movement. Well, of course, that was played by Uwe Grod, who is not a 9-year-old, but pretty amazing that Liszt was a 9-year-old when he played that. Liszt's father, recognizing his son's extraordinary talent, managed to get permission from his employer, with difficulty, managed to get permission from his employer, Prince Esterházy, to further his son's musical education and take him to Vienna for some professional piano tutoring by impressive people such as Carl Czerny, C-Z-E-R-N-Y, who quickly, after only a short while, said that there was nothing more that he could teach his young pupil. Father then took Franz and his mother to Paris, which was then perceived to be the world capital of music. Young Franz also started writing music seriously, and possibly helped by his then teacher, Ferdinando Payer, P-A-E-R, created his first and only opera, Don Sanche, Le Château d'Amour, meaning the Castle of Love, which got 4 performances at the Paris Opera in October 1825, when Franz was only 14. It got varied reviews, but the Paris Gazette de France stated that, as regards the future, we venture to believe that Le Petit Liszt, L-I-T-Z, misspelled, will not fail to live up to the great expectation that such a debut has aroused. And here was some of the overture of Don Sanche. Maybe, maybe. No, yeah. Shortly thereafter, young Franz was extremely excited to get to hear the amazing violin playing of Niccolo Paganini, which impressed him to the extent that it stimulated Franz to try to write similarly virtuosic music for the piano, some of which we'll hear later. Paganini was only 18 months older than Franz. And it's interesting to note that Franz also met Frédéric Chopin at about this time, who also was only 1 year older than him. And they became such firm friends that 25 years later, in 1850, Franz actually wrote a book about Chopin. And by the way, Chopin dedicated his Opus 10 etudes, the very difficult ones, to Franz, and his Opus 25 etudes, equally difficult, to Marie Dagout, who we'll come to shortly. By this time, the charm that the good-looking young man exerted on women was already beginning to make its strenuous presence felt. And I think Andy has a picture here to show us. Yes. Yes. And you see they're all getting very excited, throwing things at him, kisses and so forth. In the winter of 1832, when he was aged 21, still in Paris, after meeting at a Paris salon the Countess Adèle de la Prunerade, later Duchesse de Fleury, he spent some months at her lonely romantic chateau in the Alps. Then there was Countess Pauline Plater, one of many Polish aristocrats resident in the French capital, who was evidently something of a connoisseur in musicians. She said, "I would take Ferdinand Hiller as my man about the house, Frédéric Chopin as my husband, and Franz Liszt as my lover." That was her judgment on the relative merits of the three. In Paris, Franz started giving piano lessons, and among his pupils was the then 16-year-old Caroline de Sayn-Wittgenstein, whose father was the Minister of Commerce to Charles X, the King of France. Papa eventually came to realize that the lessons were going on far too long after midnight, and Franz was turned out of the house and forbidden to come back. Interestingly, despite this admonition, he did keep in touch with the young lady throughout his life, and he even left her a jewel in his will. Amazing. But towards the end of 1833 in Paris, Countess Marie Dagout, G-A-G-O-U-L-T, was among the guests at a party at which Franz had been engaged to play that evening. Now, we don't know exactly what he played, but it was probably one of his earlier etudes, maybe number 7, Eroica, one of the Paganini, by the way, etudes, Eroica. And here we're going to hear it, beginning of it, played by Boris Berezovsky. Marie Dagout was 28 and trapped in an unsatisfactory arranged marriage to the much older Count Dagout, to whom she'd already borne 2 daughters, one of whom sadly had just died. This marriage to the Count was already effectively over. Frustrated, Marie, the brilliance and impulsive originality of the handsome young Franz Liszt flooded the world with a dazzling new light. Here was a promise of liberation enshrined in a figure who conquered her the moment they set eyes on each other. For Franz Liszt, this sudden total affection by an enchanting lady of high rank quite overwhelmed him. From the beginning, the relationship was indeed true love, even though she was rather serious looking and handsome rather than beautiful. Only some months later, Franz and Marie decided to escape from the scrutinous gaze of Paris society and elope to Switzerland. But, unusually, her mother came too, not for long though. Marie hadn't told her mother that she was already pregnant with Franz. A daughter, Blondine, was born in December 1835 in Geneva. Marie's name, of course, is not recorded correctly as the mother on the birth certificate. It couldn't be because she's still married to the Count. Only Franz Liszt as the father. And we're now going to play some of Les Cloches de Genève, which Liszt wrote there and dedicated to his new daughter. It may seem a little strange to us today, but it wasn't. I don't know if you're looking at the music there, but David Corrivar, I don't know if he was, but at the bottom line there, it said PPP, which means very, very quiet. And he actually played it fortissimo. Never mind. It may seem a little strange to us today, but it wasn't quite so odd at that time. The baby was almost immediately left with a wet nurse, which I assume means breastfeeding. And the parents went off traveling to other places, ending up in Italy, where on Christmas Eve, 2 years later, another child was born on Lake Como and christened Cosima. Much more about her later. She also was left with another wet nurse as the parents traveled onwards, with Franz still composing piano works, such as the great Dante Sonata and the Paganini in Etudes, inspired by his hearing of the great violinist in Paris. And later these were renamed the Transcendental Etudes, by him, I think. Let us now listen to the beginning of one of those Transcendental Etudes, one of the most difficult piano pieces Liszt ever wrote. It's called Feu Follet, which can be translated as something approaching fireworks or shimmering fireflies. Liszt is at his musically most innovative here. The diminished scale features prominently in the glittering downward runs in the right hand, and this might be one of the very earliest uses of the diminished scale in classical music. One may also see the beginnings of a sophisticated impressionism here. The dramatic structure of the piece, its sudden tonal changes, and its evocation of will-o'-the-wisp is near perfect. And here's the first page, played by Minoru Nojima. Eventually, the couple reached Rome, where a son Daniel was born in May 1839. Although the birth of this third child might indicate otherwise, Franz and Marie were in fact already drifting apart. His constant performing absences were part of the problem. For example, in 1840, the year after Daniel was born, and he also having been left with a wet nurse, they toured to London and played at Buckingham Palace for Queen Victoria, and then 3 concerts for the Philharmonic Society. The Countess Marie d'Agoult came too, but later, when they were staying at the Grand Hotel in Richmond, she was left there while he went off to play for Lady Beresford, the Duchess of Cambridge, and Lady Jersey, and later the Duke of Beaufort. His continual absences from her were partly the cause of their difficulties. The separation gradually became more and more permanent until it ended in downright disapproval. The 3 children were eventually collected from their different wet nurses by Franz, and he placed them with his own mother, who had stayed living in Paris after his father had died there, or near there. These children never really knew their father or their mother, come to that. Liszt came into their lives only intermittently and briefly, but he always managed to provide financially for them and their education. Marie had nothing but spiteful words about Liszt's mother, Anna, whom she described as common and uneducated, which indeed, of course, she was. But in fact, Anna Liszt was generous and kind-hearted. She loved her grandchildren, and it was she who, for the first time in their lives, gave them anything approaching a mother's love. Their other grandmother, Madame de Flavigny, Marie d'Agoult's mother, wanted nothing to do with her grandchildren. In her eyes, they were simply bastards. In Paris in 1841, Franz met for the first time Richard Wagner, after which time their relationship developed for almost 40 years and was variously very strong, erratic, and sometimes stormy. But that would take too long to go into here. It needs another evening like this to describe their relationship in detail. We will come back to Wagner later on then. Franz proceeded on amazingly extensive touring performances, traveling almost constantly and giving an average of 125 concerts per year and journeying huge distances as far as Limerick in Ireland in the west, to Finland in the north, Gibraltar in the south, and Russia in the east. And this in the days when the only form of transport was a horse and carriage on roads that were little more than cart tracks. Railways did come in during the latter part of his life, but traveling by then was not at all like the high-speed trains of today. When he went by train from Weimar in Germany to Rome in Italy, it took him over 64 hours by train, 3 days. No telephones, of course. People like him corresponded extensively by handwritten letters, spending maybe a third of each day in reading and writing them. Now this letter here, if you can see it, sold recently at Sotheby's in London for £5,000. It's 3 or 4 pages, but there's nothing special or important in it. But it just shows you how valuable his correspondence is. It's astounding that Liszt became so universally famous at a time when there was no radio or TV, no internet, no recordings, no YouTube, a true genius whose wide reputation was spread almost entirely by word of mouth. All of his programs were extremely long by today's recital standards, normally several hours. In addition to the vast amount of his own compositions, he also performed extensively works by others: Bach, toccatas, preludes and fugues, and Goldberg variations; Beethoven, concertos, sonatas, and the Diabelli variations; Mendelssohn's concertos, Schumann's sonata, Carnaval, and Fantaisie, virtually the complete works of Chopin, who, on hearing Franz play, actually said that he wished he himself could play his etudes as well as did Liszt. In all, at about this time, Liszt wrote a total of 53 transcriptions of Schubert songs. Somebody wrote, after hearing Liszt play his transcription of Schubert's Erlkönig, that he was surprised to notice that when Liszt left the piano, he showed not a trace of fatigue or perspiration, whereas only a few weeks earlier, this audience member had heard Rubinstein play the same piece, and from his appearance at the end, you would have thought he had just come out of the shower with his clothes on. So here's the first page of Erlkönig, played by Yuri Rozum. Another of the main reasons for the separation of Franz from the Countess d'Agoult may very well have been the contribution of her jealousy over his interest and attraction to and for other women. Some of the women whom he entranced along the way included Countess Potocka, actress Charlotte Hagen, singers Caroline Unger and Pauline Viardot, courtesans Marie Duplessis, now she was the Dame aux Camélias of Dumas, and the colorful Spanish dancer Lola Montes, who was then between monarchs, the Tsar of Russia and King Ludwig I of Bavaria, the father of Richard Wagner's King Ludwig II. One particularly infatuated admirer, to mark her territory, stood naked on the balcony outside Liszt's room to show the world what had apparently just taken place. But we will shortly come to the big love of Franz Liszt's life. In 1847, Franz gave a recital in Kiev. Poland, Russia, it's a complicated history there, where his program included his work Hexameron. And here is an extract of one section, number 9, interlude, played here by my friend Dan Claver in San Francisco. The next day after this concert, Liszt received a letter from a wealthy aristocrat living on a large estate southwest of the town of Kiev, containing a substantial donation to the charity fund for whom he had been playing. The following day, he went to pay his respects to this benefactor, Princess Caroline Sayn-Wittgenstein. She was 28 years old and he was 36. Her father, Peter von Ivanovsky, had been a very wealthy Polish landowner who died when she was still quite young. and left her an immense fortune with a vast estate, including some 30,000 peasants. Earlier, when she was only 17, her father had forced her to marry Prince Nicholas Sayn-Wittgenstein, who was serving in the Tsar's army. 1 year after the wedding, she bore him a daughter, whose name was Maria, but separated from him soon after that. And interestingly enough, that daughter, Maria, Liszt corresponded with for many years afterward. Very friendly. They were good friends. Anyway, 1 year after the wedding, she bore him separated, but she separated from her husband soon after that and returned to the family country seat at Voronintse, Woronintce, which grand house, although it was very boring actually, was destroyed in the Second World War. She was not by any means a great beauty, but Franz Liszt was entranced. Apart from her huge amount of money, she was possessed of a very strong religious conviction, as was he, and she rapidly became his counselor and conscience. Only 6 months after them having met, this may surprise you, Liszt gave what was to be basically the final concert of his career as a professional pianist. Thereafter, he was a composer, conductor, writer, and teacher. And here is the beginning of Piano Concerto No. 2, third movement, played by Christian Zimmermann. Previously, Liszt had been offered the position of Kapellmeister by the Grand Duke of Saxon-Weimar-Eisenach, I guess those long names in German, don't they? At Weimar in Saxony. But although Liszt had given some concerts there, he had not taken up the position in earnest. Now, at the beginning of 1848, he fled there with the princess, escaping from her husband, the prince, after she had filed with the Bishop of St. Petersburg a divorce petition against her husband, claiming all sorts of things, mainly that she'd been beaten into the wedding by her father. The Grand Duchess at Weimar, Maria Pavlova, was an admirer of Franz Liszt and the sister of Tsar Nicholas I of Russia. Franz hoped that the Grand Duchess would be sufficiently interested to intercede with her brother to have Caroline's marriage annulled so that she would be free to marry Liszt. But instead, what happened was that the princess received a document from the Tsar ordering her to return to Russia on pain of banishment and the sequestration of her great estates, which of course she ignored. Mornings in Weimar at the Altenburg, which we're going to see a picture of now. It's a rather boring building, but she lived there. He wasn't allowed. Of course, they were not officially married. He still stayed at the hotel in the town, but he was there every day, and he started compositions there. Starting with the first of his 13 symphonic poems, more about them shortly, and studying the music of Bach, which may have stimulated him to write for the first time for the pipe organ. Now, he didn't really play the pipe organ, but still, he wrote some of the finest music ever written for the organ to this day. And I would love to play you the Adna sometime under, but it's 35 minutes long, so we're not going to do that. But here is the beginning of one of these magnificent pieces, the prelude from the Prelude Fugue on B-A-C-H. Now, B-A-C-H is musical note. B-A-C-H is B flat. And here we're going to play the prelude from the Prelude Fugue on B-A-C-H by Gerhard Weinberger at the splendid organ in Passau Cathedral. Wish we could play all of that, please. Anyway, for 12 years, Princess Caroline looked after Franz Liszt, carrying on her own religious writings in the same room as him. She and he both, the whole time, smoking the strongest cigars imaginable and filling the room with dense clouds of noxious smoke. Eventually, she had special cigars manufactured of greater length and double strength, dipped in iron filing, so it was said to impart a special metallic tang to their flavor. Her rooms, therefore, were charged incessantly with cigar smoke, and it may have been difficult through the blue haze to see all of the 14 busts of Liszt with which her drawing room was ornamented. The princess actually knew nothing very much about music, and neither did she sing or play an instrument, but Franz loved her all-consumingly. She loved him no less intensively for his genius, and she was an excellent hostess. She dispensed a truly regal hospitality, receiving and waiting upon her guests in sovereign style. She was, after all, a princess. She was intelligent, broadly educated, widely read, and a connoisseur of art. The only problem was that her command of the German language was highly imperfect, though nonetheless voluble. For that, with her heavy Slavic accent, she and Franz Liszt spoke to each other entirely in French. And it might be worth mentioning here that although Franz Liszt considered himself a proud Hungarian, he never ever spoke that language. He grew up speaking German with his parents, and later his preferred language was French. Time for a little more music. I mentioned that the symphonic poem was a form of music totally developed by Franz Liszt, 13 of them, of varying lengths. Here is the beginning of the 6th of those, Mazeppa. It's after a story, it depicts a story by Victor Hugo involving a man who, after he seduced a noble Polish lady, was tied naked to a wild horse and sent off into the Ukraine. Here, arpeggio and the Budapest Philharmonic play the beginning of this piece. Now, Franz Liszt as Kapellmeister extraordinaire, which means like music director, to the great ducal court of Weimar, which is a small, don't forget that Germany in those days was different states, it wasn't a country, and one of them was Weimar, quite small. But he had at his disposal his own musicians and singers, but he found it dispiriting that they're so poorly paid and with low morale. Wagner, by the way, had a similar thing, that's a different story. The orchestra initially totaled 35 players, plus a choir of 29 singers and a corps de ballet of 6 dancers. However, with this small group, Liszt did manage to conduct the world premiere first performance of an astounding list of works. Starting with Wagner's Lohengrin in 1850, he performed the opera 5 times, plus Tannhäuser and the Fliegende Holländer, the Flying Dutchman. And these were far from the only substantial operas that Liszt introduced to the Weimar public during the 1850s. Looking at the list now. He developed a repertoire of 44 operas, including Don Giovanni and Die Zauberflöte, Magic Flute, by Mozart, Iphigenie on Our Lied, Armide and Alceste by Gluck, Alfonso and Estrella by Schubert, Fidelio by Beethoven, Guillaume Tell, La Gazzaladra, L'Italiane d'Algérie, and Le Comte Ore by Rossini, Urianti by Weber, Le Pré au Clerc by Errol, La Juive by Alavi, Norma by Bellini, Flotto's Indra, Rubinstein's Die Sibirischen Jäger, Berlioz's Benvenuto Cellini, the German premiere, and Verdi's Ernani and I Due Foscari. And in 1855, Schumann's Genoveva, as well as his Faust, Manfred, and Paradise and the Peri. Several operas by Cherubini and Spontini, and the most elaborate and spectacular operas of Meyerbeer, including Les Huguenots. Also many minor works, such as King Alfred by Raff, and Barbara of Baghdad by Cornelius, and Nicolai's comic opera, Die lustige Weiber von Windsor. An astounding list. and that was operas. Also, he played the choral and orchestral works of Berlioz, Symphonie Fantastique, L'Enfance du Christ, Romeo and Juliet, and Harold in Italy, and the overtures to Waverley, King Lear and the Corsair, all of Beethoven's symphonies, including the then rarely heard Ninth, much Mozart and Haydn, the symphonies of Mendelssohn and Schumann, the oratorios, the Messiah and Samson and Delilah by Handel, and these are just mentioning the most obvious items on his program. A truly astonishing list. And all of this from a man who is now, and was then, famous for being a brilliant pianist. And to remind ourselves of that, here is the beginning of his Bravura Tarantella, published in 1861, but it was an arrangement of an earlier piece. And here it's played by Yundi Lee. I've listed all these operas and concert pieces because the amount of it is so amazing. But I have strayed from talking about his women, the amount of which is also so amazing. And do remember, of course, he is still living basically with the Princess Sayn-Wittgenstein. Over the years, Liszt faced several claims for paternity. One was from Maria von Kovacs, who bore him a child, Ilona Hörnl, on whose grave in the cemetery in Weimar is written that she is the daughter of Franz Liszt. Now, I don't know what Cosima made of that, because they were, anyway, that's another story. Yet his commitment to the princess remained surprisingly strong. This, frankly, is rather startling. The princess's apartment was permanently dark. Heavy curtains were in front of the windows, which were never opened because she lived in constant fear of drafts. Visitors were left in amazement when they entered this cave, unable to believe their watering eyes. Sitting in the middle of the room was Caroline, like an exotic spider in her web, permanently stretched out on an ottoman. Her clothes were old-fashioned, an enormous disfiguring bonnet on her large head, the ribbons tied beneath her chin. She would announce she was a spiritualist, and with ecstatic cheerfulness report the names of the deceased men and women who were currently standing beside her. Extraordinary that Franz Liszt should be so besotted. Finally, Caroline's husband, Prince Nicholas Sayn-Wittgenstein, himself decided to sue for divorce because he wished to remarry. He was still in Russia, of course. After immense paperwork, the Vatican did finally conclude in his favor, but Weimar lay in the Diocese of Fulda, F-U-L-D-A, Fulda. The Bishop of Fulda, after receiving from the papal nuncio in Vienna authority to annul the wedding, also received renewed pressure from the prince's family, who were concerned about the financial consequences of losing that rich wife. So the bishop denied the request, and the case went back to the Vatican. Now, a wonderful writer Alan Walker, who knows a huge amount about Franz Liszt, went to the Vatican and found all the papers relating to this divorce. And here they are in this book, enormous quantities of documents in, obviously in Latin, which he's translated. But the princess went to Rome to plead her case, but Liszt stayed in Weimar. Months went by with frustrating discussions and lack of resolution. Finally, in August 1861, the cardinals in Rome reaffirmed their original decision to grant the divorce. If the princess had immediately gone back to Germany, the wedding to Franz Liszt could have taken place. Instead, she wrote to him, arguing for him to join her in Rome, so they could be married in the city which embodied their most profound Catholic beliefs and aspirations. Liszt finally made his plans to leave the house in Weimar and travel to Rome. Very strangely, en route to Rome, he went to Paris to re-encounter Marie d'Agoult, the mother of his 3 children, whom he had not seen for years. He must have been feeling some sort of religious remorse, because he apparently said to her, "Marie, God bless me, please wish me no ill." He arrived in Rome early on the morning of October the 21st, 1861, the day before his 50th birthday. The princess had made huge preparations for the wedding to take place early the following day, his 50th birthday. For several days, she had been most expensively decorating the church for the service. But very late that evening, a messenger from the Vatican knocked at the door of her apartment and delivered a papal decree ordering a postponement of the wedding because yet more matters concerning her divorce needed to be investigated. To her, this was the ultimate blow of fate. Her will was now broken, and she finally gave up the fight. The martyrdom of these 2 romantic souls began. They never lived together again. For Franz Liszt, the denial of his marriage to the princess never ceased to be a source of pain and sorrow. They continued living side by side in Rome, but close together, but yet apart. Liszt turned to religion, saying, "I submit my soul with jubilation to the gentle yoke of Christ, seeking in humility to act as his church commands. I feel a Christian to the depths of my being." He started writing an epic dramatic cantata, The Legend of Saint Elizabeth. In performance, it is almost impossible to accomplish this work because it takes over 4.5 hours in its entirety. It took him 5 years to write. He finished it in 1866. But here is a little of the section where Saint Elizabeth is turned out into the storm by her mother. Die Pforte schloss sich.
Schloss sich
Liszt also wrote a 14-scene oratorio, Christus, and various masses, psalms, and hymns during these years in Rome, and also 2 legends for piano, St. Francis preaching to the birds and St. Francis walking on the water. Now, the big St. Francis preaching to the birds, Liszt actually played to Pope Pius IX himself, who actually visited France in his monastic cell. Amazing. Anyway, here it is performed by my friend Daniel Glover. Two of Franz Liszt's children by Marie d'Agoult, his first daughter and his son, Daniel, had died. Their mother, the Countess d'Agoult, had long ceased to have a place in his life. The woman he most wanted, the Princess Caroline, could not now become his wife. His remaining daughter, Cosima, was still locked in a marriage to Hans von Bülow, which brought her less and less joy. All things in his life seemed very desolate. As a sideline, it is interesting to note that Hans von Bülow was Liszt's most favorite pupil for 10 years, starting out back in Berlin. And in 1857, it was he who Franz asked to premiere his greatest piano work, the sonata in B minor. And now here is our great Leslie Howard, one of the person in the world who knows more about Franz Liszt than anyone imaginable. And he actually recorded all of Franz Liszt's music. And here he is playing a brief extract from that magnificent piano piece. In 1863, Liszt went to live in a monastery on the outskirts of Rome. He lived in Spartan conditions in one small room with a table and chair, pictures of saints on the walls, a marble cast of Chopin's right hand, and a battered, out-of-tune upright piano with one note missing. In 1865, he entered into the ecclesiastical state by receiving minor holy orders, and for the rest of his life wore a cassock and wished to be known as the Abbé Liszt. His great friend, sort of friend anyway, great, Richard Wagner, wrote in his diary, now this may surprise you considering that Wagner spent years about this time writing his final very religious opera, Parsifal. But he wrote in his diary, "To me, this Catholic rubbish is repugnant to the very depth of my soul." I should perhaps have previously mentioned that Liszt's daughter, Cosima, had by now divorced Hans von Bülow after living in sin with Richard Wagner for several years. But remember that her father and mother never married, so she and her siblings were all bastards themselves. She had now married Wagner in a Protestant ceremony. For this, she first had to renounce her Catholic religion, which renunciation had caused huge problems between her and her father. So they didn't speak or write to each other for a long time. Liszt's religious fervor, however, did not prevent him from continuing to have interest in complex female relationships. He was now spending about a third of each year back in Weimar, where the Baroness Olga von Meyendorff also took residence to be near him, her baron having died unexpectedly young. She was known as the Black Cat by Liszt's piano students, since she had an icy coldness to them and could show her claws at any moment. She liked to be called Your Excellency and was very jealous of Liszt's young female students. Another young lady who attached herself to Franz Liszt about this time was Olga Janina, who claimed to be a Cossack countess, although in reality she was neither a Cossack nor a countess. She visited Liszt at the Villa d'Este, where France in Italy, near Rome, where Franz would sit for days on end in the beautiful garden with its fountains and centuries-old cypress trees, which cast a magical spell on him. And here we're going to hear the beginning of Les Jeux d'eau at the Villa d'Este, played by Bertrand Chamayou. I should perhaps explain that Les Jeux d'eau means fountains. Another woman who threw herself, which I thought was beautifully captured by Liszt there. Another woman who threw herself at Liszt was Hortense Voigt, V-O-I-G-T, who even claimed to be his fiancée, which caused Anton Bruckner to call Franz a Don Juan, but Liszt assured him she was a madwoman. Talking of famous visitors, Edvard Grieg, another adoring visitor, greatly admired Liszt, especially after 1870, when to his astonishment, Franz sight-read through Grieg's piano concerto in A minor, entirely from the penciled manuscript. Johannes Brahms visited for 10 days in 1853, but when asked to perform his scherzo in E-flat minor, his courage failed him. To his amazement, Liszt took the barely legible manuscript and sight-read through the piece flawlessly. In 1876, Liszt read in a newspaper of the death of the mother of his children, the Countess Marie. He wrote to Caroline, "I cannot grieve for her after her death any more than I could during her lifetime." Very sad lack of compassion, it seems to me. Later that year, he traveled to Bayreuth for the premiere of Wagner's Ring Cycle, the newly completed Great Festival Theatre. He was just one among very many distinguished personalities who attended that amazing occasion. Never been anything like it in musical history before or since. These personalities included no less than the Emperor Dom Pedro of Brazil, who came all the way there specially, King Ludwig II of Bavaria, who had largely actually paid for the theatre and the operas, the Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany, Grand Duke Vladimir of Russia, great numbers of princes. Can you imagine trying to sort out the seating? Great number of princes and princesses, counts and countesses, and very many musical personalities, including Tchaikovsky, who complained that the town of Bayreuth was so full it was impossible to find even a crust of bread or a glass of beer. Anton Bruckner, Edvard Grieg, and Saint-Saëns were among many other musicians who came to that amazing event. In these twilight years, Liszt's music took on a more remote phase, with only fleeting images of color against an orally undistinguished background, rather bereft of energy and tension. Several miniatures of his anticipated music that was not to be written until many decades later, their harmonic writing bordering on atonality. Some of the pieces are filled with deep melancholy. Arnold Schoenberg, writing in 1911, stated that the effects of Liszt's musical writing had been greater on later composers than Wagner's had been. But Cosima noted that Richard Wagner had only words of contempt for his father-in-law's newly ascetic style, which he found completely meaningless and possessed of budding insanity. And he could not develop a taste for their dissonances. Now here is some of Nuages Gris, which means grey clouds, played by Paul Lewis. In 1886, Liszt did make one last visit to London for the first time in over 40 years and visited Queen Victoria at Windsor Castle to play for her. This year, which is to be the last year of his life, he also, this is amazing really, last year of his life, he visited Venice, Budapest, Vienna, Liège, Antwerp, Paris, and Luxembourg, where he played what was to be his last recital. This program included his Liebestraum No. 1 from the Soirée de Vienne. Now note that he played the number 1, not the now much better known number 3. And here is the opening of that work, played by George Bollet. For some time, Franz Liszt had been looked after by another adoring young lady, Lena Schmalhausen. One could really say nursed, because by now, I think you have a picture of her, by the way, yes. Because by now he was almost completely blind with cataract. He had scarcely any teeth, and dropsy had caused his feet to swell right up to his knees. He was already seriously ill, but he went to Bayreuth for his daughter Cosima's first performance of Tristan and Isolde since Wagner's death. Cosima had assumed the great composer's mantle, and as his widow, she was basically so preoccupied with the task of mounting the opera and the Bayreuth Festival that she found herself basically too busy to visit her father other than briefly. Pneumonia in those days was incurable. Liszt died there quietly and alone. Very sad. He is buried in the Bayreuth cemetery, and we'll come to picture that shortly. 7 months later, the Princess Caroline Sayn-Wittgenstein also died in Rome and was buried in Rome. End of story. But we do have the legacy of Liszt's amazing and extraordinarily extensive musical creations. And so to finish, it seems to me appropriate, because of Liszt's seemingly inexhaustible fascination with beautiful women, to play the last few minutes of his Faust Symphony, which closes with a magnificent musical setting of Goethe's Chorus Mysticus, Das ewig Weibliche zieht uns hinan. The eternal woman leads us onwards. And here to accompany that wonderful finale is pictured his grave. Definitely an ending. Okay, Michael, back to our host, Michael Bousfield.
This has been the third of our Music Club live presentations. We'll have a break now for the summer. what happens thereafter very much depends on a gentleman called Mr. COVID. We'll just have to see what happens, but we are planning to get back to live events with the music club come the autumn and winter. We're looking forward to another music evening with Tony Palmer. We will have our much delayed AGM, probably October, November, but a date very much confirmed for your diaries. The Christmas dinner will be going ahead this year on December the 8th, and Dame Anne Evans and her husband John Lucas have very kindly agreed to be our guests for then. We owe a very big thank you, Robert, for your knowledge, your background, your experience, your skill. Thank you so much. Andrew Bousfield as our technical host, and wish you all a very pleasant evening and rest of the summer, and see you at some of our events in the autumn and the winter. Good night.